Hello, and a very warm welcome back to the annual council meeting for our last session. I'm really excited about this panel where we're going to be talking about some of the results that we found from the opinion poll that I mentioned in my opening remarks at the beginning of the annual council meeting, our Unlock Europe poll. Susi, Dennison, who runs our European Power Programme, is going to very briefly talk you through some of the findings, and then I'm thrilled to be talking through what they mean with Ivan Krastev, who is a founding board member of ECFR and permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, as well as the head of the centre, the chairman of the Centre for Liberal Strategies in Sofia. And above all, the author of a brand new book about the political impact of the COVID crisis on Europe called Is It Tomorrow Yet? Paradoxes of the Pandemic, which will be published in 20 countries, many of which have already published it. And the second speaker is Alexander Soros, who is ECFR council member. He is the vice chair of the Open Society Foundations and has been heavily involved in this Unlock project from the beginning, and it's been a real source of inspiration trying to understand how European and American politics have been changing over the last few years. But before we go to them, I want to ask Susi Dennison to briefly talk us through some of the top findings in a video which she recorded. So take it away, Susi.
When it became clear in the first months of 2020 that the Covid-19 crisis was going to majorly shape the way that Europeans think about their societies and governments, but also the world around them and how Europe connects with it, we decided at ECFR to carry out a major pan-European study to understand this impact. In late April this year, we surveyed 9 EU member states covering 2/3 of the EU's population and GDP and over 11,000 respondents in order to ask a set of questions about the European project and the world. Here are the 5 key insights from that process. There is a strong sense of disappointment with the EU institutions and particularly their performance in handling the pandemic. There was strong disagreement with the idea that the European Union had lived up to its responsibilities in almost all member states. And perhaps even more worryingly, 47% of those polled felt that the EU had actually been irrelevant on the crisis, on a different question. There is a resilient sense that there is a need for more EU cooperation. When we asked how the crisis had changed people's perceptions of the EU, there were majorities in every member state which felt that this crisis had shown the need for greater European cooperation rather than that EU integration had gone too far. The transatlantic ties are broken, with perceptions of the US as an ally and an actor plummeting across Europe. Majorities in every member state except Italy, Poland and Bulgaria, where there are still large minorities, say their opinion of the US has worsened during the crisis. And the number of respondents in this year's survey who felt the US had been a key ally for their country in this crisis were vanishingly small, with Italy the largest answer at just 6%. Perceptions of China and Russia have also dropped among almost all voter groups and almost all countries. COVID-19 has impacted different countries and groups in different ways. And these different groups need to be approached by European leaders in different ways. But despite diverging experiences of the corona crisis, there are real opportunities to build concrete policies around common concerns and reconstruct a permissive consensus for the European project. The corona crisis has sensitized European voters to the need to be prepared for the next crisis. Support for more attention to be paid to tackling climate change has grown everywhere, as high as 60% in Spain, with those who have grown more supportive outstripping those who are less so in every country we covered. However, they also want the EU to put in place better tools for the next crisis, stronger borders so we can have more control when we need to next time a crisis comes around, but also taking advantage of economies of scale in the response. When we asked how Europe should change after this crisis, the top answers were cooperation on global challenges, sharing the financial burden, control of borders, but also building economic sovereignty. In Germany and France in particular, there were strong reported increases in support for businesses being encouraged to bring production back to Europe, over 50% in both the EU's two largest member states regarding medical supplies, and around 40% for both in non-medical supplies.
Fantastic. So if you enjoyed that, you can see much more detail in the report which Susi, Dennison, and a number of other colleagues have put out yesterday, called Together in Trauma, Europeans and the World After COVID-19. And Ivan Krastev and I also published a paper using some of the data from this survey last week, which we sent around to all of you as well, looking at particularly how the crisis had changed people's worldviews. What I suggest is maybe we go to you first, Ivan, to lay out some of the ways that you think that the crisis has impacted on EU politics. And then we can talk to Alex to get his perspective from across the Atlantic, and also to think about how it might change the transatlantic relationship and China, some of the data that Susi's just been talking us through. Ivan, do you want to go first?
Okay, thank you. So let's start with the most important things. We try to talk about public opinion, but we are much more measuring, honestly speaking, public moods. Because public opinion is really very much changing. The crisis has a dynamic of its own. Countries are opening and closing again. So in a certain way, we try to measure the view of the people in a moment in which the crisis is not over. It's also changing very much from the simply public health crisis also to the economic one. I'm saying this because the volatility is extremely important, and we should be careful that we're just measuring a certain momentum. But what for me was the most critical, and I am very grateful to the colleagues from the ECFR, which did a lot of work together with YouGov on the data, is the following. Sovereignty was a major issue after the two previous crises that the European Union was facing. I mean the global financial crisis and the refugee crisis of 2015. But before, the problem of sovereignty always was the sovereignty of the national state versus Brussels. This is the first crisis, if we believe the data that we are working with, that Europeans discovered that it's not about the sovereignty of the nation state versus the sovereignty of European Union. This is basically the relevance of Europe in the world. And this is quite important because it was exactly the change of the way Europeans were seeing the world. That is one of the major results of this crisis. First, Europeans saw multilateral institutions, to which we have been so much investing in, being ineffective. And they have been ineffective, particularly in a crisis that looks as if this is the crisis in which international cooperation should be back. If we cannot cooperate after the pandemic, can you imagine what kind of other much more divisive crisis we should see? Secondly, we saw basically, for different reasons, the view of China and the United States changing. In the case of China, basically Europeans for a long period of time has been trying to tell ourselves that nevertheless the China is different on the level of political regimes, on the level of objectives, but basically the major interest of Chinese government is in economic cooperation. And as a result of this crisis, not simply because of the origin of the virus, but because of the way China tried to exploit the crisis in order to promote its interest in Europe, we see almost 1/3 of the Europeans different for different countries that became much more disappointed and much more worried about what they're seeing. And I do believe this kind of a shift is going to impact the way the Europeans are treating different issues, starting with 5G, but also the political kind of security coming from the global supply chains. With the United States, I do believe it's also extremely important, of course, not to overinterpret, and I'm very much interested in what Alex has to say, but there is something very important. Europeans in general have been quite critical to the position of the current American administration. So what we see, of course, is very much kind of the result of the United States being totally absent as a global leader in this crisis. Basically, the President Trump not simply was not doing well in the United States, but he basically get United States outside of the leadership position during this crisis. But I do believe we see something deeper in the European reactions. As a result of this crisis, the United States started to look very much as a kind of a broken hegemon, which is much more focused on the internal problems. And as a result, many Europeans basically had the feeling that we are very lonely in the world. And here, and I'm going to conclude on this, comes the most paradox of this crisis, and probably in policy terms, the most important outcome of it. While Europeans are not impressed by the way the European institutions performed during this crisis, when it comes to the performance of the nation states, it's very much is different from countries to countries. There are countries that were quite self-confident about what their governments did, but there are countries which were not. But in general, as a result of this failure of the European Union, we ended up with a very strong majority that declared that in this world, post-COVID-19 world, which is going to be a world much more torn apart, the world which intensified the competition and rivalry between the United States and China, we need a much more sovereign European Union. So the push for European cooperation, not necessarily deeper European integration, is very much there. And while before the talk about geopolitical commission and geopolitical European Union was just the position of some of the European leaders, I do believe for the first time, at least at the moment, you have European public opinion which kind of shifted on a geopolitical mind.
Great. That's a perfect bridge to Alex. So you're sitting in the heart of the COVID storm at the moment in the US. And as you look out at this geopolitical world that Ivan just described, how do you think the Europeans are going to cope with it? What did you take out of the data that we've got back from this poll so far?
Well, it's great to be with you, Mark, and with everyone virtually. I'm not in the epicenter because I'm in New York State, which is rose to the occasion after a very rocky start with COVID. But the U.S. is still. You talk of first waves, you talk of second wave. There's one wave, and it's a tsunami, and it's impacting us horribly. I think when it comes to the data that ECFR provided, I thought what was quite interesting, besides the points that Ivan made around China and a shifting, let's say, geopolitical awareness or geopolitical mood, was a relatively high pro-European sentiment of Germany, particularly if you take the last few crises. Whether we're going to call this a Hamiltonian moment, a proto-Hamiltonian moment, or any other name, the data shows in many ways that Merkel and Scholz are able to position themselves the way they are because German public opinion is very much backing them. I think it's also important to note there that the German economy now is also different than it was in the financial crises in the past, and that all of the emphasis you're seeing regarding the recovery mechanism is putting the most important emphasis on the single market. But I must say that from the U.S., when we know if we could travel to Europe, the health, the reaction of COVID and the health services, even in Italy, which we saw as horrible at first, has shown to persevere. Europe is talking about opening up. We're talking about being in lockdown through the election. So I don't think that so I think that Europe winds up looking quite good coming out of COVID, versus the U.S. where we're having arguments over whether or not to wear masks.
And what about the more kind of international aspects? You've been thinking a lot about the transatlantic relationship and how that can be healed. How did you feel when you looked at the sort of collapse in people's sentiment about Trump's America? How much of that do you think is structural? How much of that do you think could be changed if Biden's elected?
Well, I think Americans share the European disappointment in the U.S. Interestingly, Gallup, since they started polling on American pride in their own country, the numbers are the lowest since the polling ever started 30 years ago. So there's obviously great disappointment. I think that there has been this view that somehow the American population, which has been representative in Trump's winning of the Electoral College in 2016, has somehow become more isolationist. And I think that if you look at American opinions, Americans care about their perception in the world. And Trump is very vulnerable in this election regarding America's standing, and I think the COVID response is very much there. I mean, I think that whenever there's been a world challenge, Americans like to think that we've risen to the occasion. And one thing which is very obviously absent to this challenge is that you don't see any form of international response, let alone a coordinated national response. So obviously I think that this is something that plays in to things. But I think that while but I think there's also something which I've noticed in European punditry. You see it in the pages of the Financial Times every week. Is a sort of idea that America is gone no matter who wins. And in a way, it's good because it sets the bar very low for American re-entry into the international arena, so that the Biden administration can overperform. But it's been saying this of basically every Democratic candidate, whether it was Warren or Bernie Sanders, and I think all of them, by the way, are people that believe in multilateralism and would turn to Europe, for common strategic interests and goals, particularly. When it comes to climate change or human rights or issues, or issues of trade, but I think that in many respects, a Biden administration may be more uncomfortable for a lot of Europeans in the current moment. While it may be a relief on some issues, Trump is providing the perfect excuse for Europe not to make some very tough decisions on its strategic direction, and on China. And I say that particularly today, on a day when China officially probably voted for the end of Hong Kong as we know it, and European voices will largely be silent and self-censored. And now we have obviously horrible reports of what's occurred in China. Not to say that Europe is necessarily, like the U.S., a bastion of human rights anymore. But also goes to say that I think that a Biden victory is a cause for a reset. How radical that reset will be is more, I think, depends more on the perception of what people think the transatlantic alliance is capable of. But at the very least, I mean, it will be a return of America to the multilateral international forums. I don't know about the International Criminal Court. That may be the one where America still won't join. But on the majority of areas, you've already seen a willingness from the Biden campaign to that America would re-enter the world.
Biden is elected and makes this offer that Europeans can't refuse, that he will rejoin the Paris Accords, rejoin the JCPOA, and stop removing troops from Germany on the basis, so long as the Europeans do one thing and align fully on China.
So I didn't get, is that for me or Ivan?
I was just wondering whether
it's for Biden.
What you want?
Oh, okay.
No, what do you think the
He's
European
just getting out of his
response would be,
basement.
Ivan?
No, listen, I agree with Alex on one thing, and this is basically that European pessimism about America can become a self-fulfilling prophecy, and that for good reasons, we have the reasons. On the other side, I do believe some people around Biden are also too optimistic about the relationship. And the story is we are never going to be back where we were. And this is not because, for example, Joe Biden is not a transatlantic person, but because we see a structurally different world. But there are three areas in which Biden's America is going to be of critical importance to the European Union. First, of course, is climate change. Nevertheless, of what Europeans are doing, nevertheless, of what kind of sovereignty we can achieve. Having one of the most important political forces in Europe these days being the Green movement, for the Green voters, saving the climate cannot be just achieved by European effort. For this, you need the United States. By the way, you also need China. So having Biden administration changing the American position on climate change is going to be critical for anything. Secondly, I do believe Biden could be quite important when it comes to your idea of the trade relations and particularly the new technologies and this technological wall, which can end up with the confrontation between the United States and China. What cannot happen that from this point of view, it's interesting because strangely enough, the transatlanticism of Biden can become a problem too. Because he's one of the very few, the only leader who had a kind of, if he's going to be elected, that have an experience from the time of the Cold War. And in the view of the United States, basically the relations between then United States and Western Europe was the model for a functioning transatlantic relationship. But to be honest, from the point of view of countries like Germany or France, going back to the Cold War type of partnership is a loss of sovereignty. Europeans basically have learned to have much more of it, and they're going to push for a much more serious partnership debate. So this is going to be a different relationship. I do believe it could be much more productive because both United States and Europe are understanding better part of the problems that we are facing and also part of the constraints. So yeah, this is a new world, and I don't believe that we should simply try to go back where we are. From this point of view, what Merkel was saying recently, what Minister Mas was saying recently was a very strong signal. We are not about restoring the transatlantic relationship, we should reinvent it.
Mark, I can't hear you.
Mark?
I'm very sorry. Classic rookie mistake. Sorry, I put myself on mute. I'd love to hear what you think of that, Alex. And while you're speaking, if people want to ask questions from the council, please raise your hand or write things into the chat box. Or if you're watching this being live streamed, you can answer questions on Twitter using hashtag ECFR20. But Alex, why don't you tell us what you think about the idea of transforming the transatlantic relationship?
As I said earlier, I think that in many respects the bar has been set, so low that it'll be easy to overachieve. At the same point, I think that Biden does pose a problem because of his transatlantic credentials, because of his history, because he actually knows many of the leaders that are in power, particularly Chancellor Merkel, and it's a history of working with them. The U.S. has changed, its view on its policy towards China. This is not a Republican thing or a Democrat thing. This is an overall American thing. And whether it's on human rights or on trade. This is the direction, and certainly the mood. But I think that at a bare minimum, Europeans should feel comfortable that they're not going to get sanctions, and tariffs against them. That the Biden administration would put a restart to the New START negotiations with Russia and missile deterrence. I think it's a larger question when it comes to issues of trade, but I think that here the European public and many European capitals fail to see the extent to which the current U.S.-China arrangement comes at the expense of the European economy. It cuts out large amounts of the European economy that could be put at use, especially if you look at areas like, agriculture, but also any forms of, of exports. But I think that that the U.S. would definitely look for, towards Europe, because there's a symbiotic relationship, particularly I would say in the American liberal or left. We look at the welfare state as something nice. We look at the very many things that Europe has as something that we want. So, and also the importance of climate change that Ivan mentions. So I think that there's the question is the proof will be in the pudding. After months of protracted ballot counting as we go into a COVID election, which may not resolve itself and may end in the Supreme Court, if I can be so pessimistic.
Should we take some of the questions from the audience? There's a question from Andre Wilkins for Ivan. It says, "Hi Ivan, in the current context, would you review your thesis on the disintegration trend of after Europe? Is the corona crisis becoming an integration moment for Europe?"
You should not push me too much on optimism. This is not where I come from, but I do believe that there is a momentum. But it's extremely important to understand the nature of the momentum. And also the situation can easily go wrong. Because if the European Union cannot act as after this crisis, then we're going to see a prolonged paralysis. And this prolonged paralysis over a kind of a decade is going to make European Union irrelevant, regardless of the fact who is living and who is staying. For me, the most important is that this crisis on one level demonstrated the strengths of the national sentiments. It was not by accident that in the first 2 weeks, the national borders were immediately closed, and it was done by pro-European governments like Germany and some more nationalistic governments. So from this point of view, to believe that we're in a kind of a new federalist moment is going to be a huge misreading of the situation. But at the same time, this crisis shows the economic limits of nationalism. In the way you cannot stay all your life in your apartment in order not to be infected with COVID-19, basically the economies cannot stay in their borders if they want basically to survive and to function. And from this point of view, I do believe that there is a chance, and there is a chance exactly because of the critical nature of the crisis. And I do believe that the German Chancellor was very kind of clear on this. Unlike the previous crisis in which you can survive simply by meddling through, simply by avoiding kind of radical solutions. This time you cannot do it, but for me it is critically important to understand that in order to succeed, European leaders should not simply do the right things, but they should also use the right language. And from this point of view, what is important at this critical moment is that support for Europe is very much support for the European cooperation, for Europe consolidating and trying to face the world as one. At the same time, people are still quite kind of skeptical about simply giving more powers to Brussels and basically going beyond the nation state. So if the European leaders decide to make this mistake and go with this rhetoric, we can have a backlash, and this backlash can be really a killing for the European project.
There are 3 questions that have come in on Zoom, so I'll ask them all as a group, and then you come to the two of you to choose which ones you want to answer. The first is about Russia. It basically says that Russia is going to become a key presidential campaign issue in the US, meaning that the US political scene is likely to polarize yet more on Russia. What should Europeans want from a US-Russia policy, either in a Biden or a Trump administration? Actually, why don't we take that one first, because it's a big question, and then I can ask the other questions afterwards. Alex, you want to go first, or? Yeah,
I mean, look, obviously, Russia, remains part of the, part of American political discourse. I'm not sure how much foreign policy is really going to play into the campaign. Biden is ascending because of the way that he's taken he's taken the vote from of American seniors, because Donald Trump forgot that Americans are quite scared of death, and he's decided to gamble on that. And if you look at where Biden has made most of his inroads, I mean, the fact that he's up in Florida by 8 points right now, really shows that. So I don't know the extent to which Americans are going to talk at all about foreign policy. I think it would be smart to. I think and I think that obviously, if America had the multilateral access and tools it used to have, we wouldn't be in the situation we are in. But you're really going to be talking about an America that is really consumed by domestic issues. Although I do think something has radically changed in the establishment, which is that the old idea that America wanted to play a game to wedge Russia and China is basically over. And I don't think that the idea of bringing Russia closer to us or China closer to us so that the two won't be stronger together, I think Americans ultimately, while we see Putin as strong, coronavirus has proven Putin to be weaker, and Russia to be weaker. I mentioned what I said earlier about restarting the START negotiations, but I think that the as some Democrats and Americans said last year when we brought people together at ECFR, America would be willing to trade the Russia-China wedge away in order to get closer with Europe.
What do you think, Ivan, on Russia?
Listen, for the last 4 years, the United States did not have a Russia policy. It was a totally domestic politics. Even if President Trump has certain ideas about what he wanted to do with Russia, because of the Russia interference in the American elections, basically he was not legitimate to do it. And when it basically came to the Democratic Party, for them there was no Russia. Basically it was about Trump. As a result of it, Europe also did not have relations, because you cannot have relations with Russia if you don't know where the United States is standing on this relationship. So for the last 4 years, basically both of us have been locked, and we are trying much more to try to see what is not going to change. I agree with Alex on the fact that this kind of a wish of menace, that basically the United States and European Union easily can decouple China and Russia, I find it unlikely. And this is not because Russia does not have their own problems with the rise of China, but because at this moment, I do believe Russia policy is going to stand in the way it is, which means not always with China, but never against China. The problem is different. And the problem is that when the next administration comes, the most important things that Europeans are going to look like is not simply the new presidential policy, but the new foreign policy consensus in the United States. Because if we are going to have a sleepless nights, anytime when there are presidential elections in the United States, if you believe that the American policy with respect to Russia or China is going to change every 4 years, for Europe is going to be very difficult. And as a result of it, this is going to be quite important. I do believe that the other important challenge that Biden administration is going to face is basically how to deal with Trump's allies within the European Union. And there are certain European governments that basically went into this alliance. Some of them basically now are getting symbolic help for the elections from the President Trump, and President Biden should try to see how he's going to work with this, because the problem is that European Union is so institutionally complicated mechanism that 2 and 3 countries can block almost any policy. And I see also the Russia policy in the context of this kind of on one level, institutional strangeness of the European Union as a foreign policy player, where some small countries can basically veto a lot of things, and on the other side, the lack of the foreign policy consensus in the United States.
Okay, there are a bunch of new questions that have come in, so I might group them a little bit. There are a couple of questions about climate, which you both spoke about. So Patricia Sasnal says the Paris Agreement is not enough, to say the least. If Biden wins, will US-Europe present a new ambitious agenda together? And then Daniel Levy has asked another question, saying that, asking, is climate the issue that forces US-China to be less confrontational and opens an avenue to cooperation for Biden with follow-on impact for Europe? Do you two want to talk about the climate ones? Alex, do you want to go first?
Sure. I think that on climate, there will be a willingness from the U.S. to have to come to some sort of G2 with China on climate. We have the evidence of Chinese backsliding after the work that the Obama administration did with China on the issue. And I think that you have talk in Democratic foreign policy circles about having to kind of siphon that off from the larger human rights or competition issues. So I think that will very much be present. Regarding Paris, I do think that whichever Democratic team would come in, it would have to be, they would have to go more ambitious with the idea that this is going to be a key lever of foreign policy going forward, and somewhere where you may be able to deliver. I think it's also important to note that in the U.S., there's no difference between young Democrats and young Republicans on climate change. So, so you're basically making a generational bet.
So, Patricia Sasnal asked another question, which is, Heiko Maas yesterday said the new old POTUS would have to be presented with a constructive agenda in security and trade from Europe. What should it consist of? Ivan, do you want to go first? What should Europeans take to the new president?
First, I do believe it's quite important also to be very much aware that if everything is right, if Biden is going to be elected, nevertheless, basically, he's going to face a very difficult situation. First, because the Trump voters are not going to disappear from the American society as the result of the elections. I hope that also Senate is going to allow him to have a majority that allows him to act. But also what is going to be very important is to try to see what is happening in Europe itself. So when you're asking others to deliver, it should be also very clear what we can do. So on one level, I really believe that climate change is critical, and exactly for the reason that Alex was talking, and this is the generational bet. By the way, COVID-19 is going to have an interesting generational impact. In a strange way, you're going to see the older generation much more trying to stay home because of a high-risk vulnerabilities and others. And you're going in politics, in public life, in business, kind of the dynamism of the young generation, which otherwise does not have the numbers. In Europe, basically, the younger generation is a minority. And I do believe from this point of view, focusing on a policy which is going to create a different type of identity between the United States and European Union as a foreign policy players, very much focused on climate, but not simply because of climate. This is the way to talk to others. Climate is the way to claim global public goods. This is the only way from which you really believe that you have the right also to basically push your values. And also, I do believe also for economic reasons, if the United States and Europe are going really to invest in this type of a new green technologies and others, we're going to have an advantage which is going to help us. So I do believe this is important, and this is going to be also important for Biden himself, who should bridge the generation of young voters, which is so critical, not simply for his elections, but basically for remaking the Democratic Party. So from this point of view, I can see Biden, if basically his presidency is going to be successful, much more to be the grandfather of the nation than the father of the nation. Something, by the way, that President van der Bellen is doing extremely successfully in a country like Austria. But the second thing is going to be classical security issues. And as you know, all these conversations about President Trump trying to move American forces out of Germany, pushing them to Poland, and so on. I'm even not taking a position. Probably getting some American forces outside of Germany is not the end of the world, but it's quite important to come and to have a common security agenda. And I do believe it also means that the European Union really should be ready to invest, but not simply to invest in NATO, but to invest in its kind of own capacity to defend, because part of European hysterical reactions also from time to time to any American administration is when you're allowing such a huge level of asymmetrical relationship on the security issues, it's not easy to be sane. And the third level on which I do believe is really going to be interesting but difficult for both sides is going to be trade. Because if you see the public opinion polls, you can see that European public is moving to a kind of a progressive protectionism, which means that we want basically to have some of the productions relocated back home. And if we don't believe that we can manage globalization, what we hope is that we're going to tax people who are not producing it the way we want. I have the feeling that the same sentiment is also present in the United States. From this point of view, Europe and the United States are not so different. And I do believe we should try to find a new way to try to see this free trade, fair trade, basically how this demand for more security and much more mistrust to the global markets that have been generated by the latest crisis, not only the COVID, but also global financial crisis, is going to impact the future of the transatlantic relations.
Great. So, Alex, if you were offering a word of advice to European leaders about what they should take to Washington after the election, what do you think they should take if they want to reboot the relationship?
I don't think they have. I don't think they have to take anything. I think the Biden administration will actually come with a lot. The question is, what ultimately they want, because I think that on questions of 5G and of and America's desire to invest in European companies and in the single market, I think that's going to remain, especially as it's going to be much more difficult to work with China. I think, but I also think that something which Ivan said, which is sort of this this soft deglobalization, and sort of unified isolationism actually can, while yes, Americans may have similar views because of the COVID crisis and you seeing the impact in supply chains, that actually, given the fact that the American economy now, even the way that the market is responded is basically sectoral and tech dependent. It's in the areas where Europe is actually weakest. So I think Europe is gonna and from an economic point of view, going to be in a much weaker position in January than a lot of people expect. You're already seeing a lot of issues in the banking sector, for example. So I think good old American trade will do Europe good. Of course, I don't think Europe's going to come there. Europeans are going to come and say, "Oh, come trade with us at the expense of China." That's more, maybe some people from ECFR would, but I don't think that's happening.
Okay. So we have a few more questions in the chat box, but I think there's a real person who's willing to ask a question in person now. Mabel, do you want to come in now? Mabel. Okay, while we're waiting for Mabel, maybe I'll read one of the other texts out, which is from Anthony Dworkin. He says, is there a tension between the EU's sovereignty agenda and its commitment to multilateralism? How far can the EU both act geopolitically to protect its citizens in this competitive great power world and also reinforce the rules-based order in institutions? How far are these goals inextricably linked, and how far does the EU have to choose between them? Ivan, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I can try. No, I do believe that at least when it comes to the European political elites, effective multilateralism is the first choice. But basically, this crisis was a huge disappointment of people who basically were betting on effective multilateralism. Because, as I said early on, if you compare different crises that the world can face, wars, great migrations, climate change, pandemics, you can expect that pandemic is the crisis on which the chances to have a coordinated and effective international response is highest. It affects all of us. It is not dividing countries in the way the wars are doing. It does not have the same kind of diverse effects as some of the great migration crises can be. And also compared with the climate change, the level of urgency is very strong. And then you have this crisis that should be the most promising from the point of view of the multilateralists. And what we had as a response was basically the lack of international response. So from this point of view, what you see of the European public opinion, they basically discovered this type of European sovereignty and the problem of, for example, progressive protectionism, not as a value choice, but as a kind of a default option. I don't believe that as a result of it, the European Union is not going to try to continue pushing for much more effective multilateralism. And don't forget that already on the second week of the crisis, German President Steinmeier came with the famous article in FT with some of the leaders from outside China and the United States, trying to come with the model of multilateralism when it comes to the vaccine, which is led by the middle-sized countries, and then the European Union took the initiative, and you have this vaccine initiative. But at the moment, the problem is that it's not that European Union is put to choice on a value level what we liked most, effective multilateralism or this type of European sovereignty. But you cannot be the only multilateralist in the world and you believe that this is going to work for you.
Okay, should we get Mabel to come back in with her question?
Can you hear me now?
Loud
Yay,
and
hooray.
clear.
Hi, Ivan. Hi, Alex. Lovely to see you all. I had a question. We've been talking a lot about what leadership should do, but the leaders who are currently in power have been working on a crisis for a couple of months and seem to be quite exhausted. Some of them started with limited leadership skills in the first place. And so I wonder, while all this, big change has to happen, how can we do that with individuals who might actually no longer have the energy to do this, nor the time or vision to think big? And how can we, as ordinary citizens, try to make sure that they do the right thing?
Alex, do you want to have a shot at that? As a young and vigorous person who wouldn't understand this problem.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how. It's hard to tell, how exhausted various leaders are. But it seems, although it seems to me that the thing that's going to be the larger issue is how the German presidency, delivers this recovery instrument, and the fact that it's going to weigh heavily on both the finance minister and the chancellor to do so. Although I've been hearing that the chancellor is in her best form for the last two or three years, but at the same time, I think that that there is substantial, at least when you see it in the data sets, there is substantial buy-in into the idea that Europe has a role to play. And I'm not sure how exhausted people are, because they're willing to negotiate for various rebates, whether over Wiener VATs on Wiener Schnitzel or not. So I don't know. I think you're in for a long. You may be in for a long summer.
Okay. So Andre Wilkins has kindly asked me whether I think that Europe will still run the 21st century and whether things will be different in January. I think that what is coming out of this is a sense that increasingly we're going to have quite a fragmented world, and that the best thing we can hope for is Europeans standing up and taking on more responsibility for creating the sort of world that they want to live in within the European space, and in order to do that, functioning a new set of relationships with other players. So it's more a moment for European exceptionalism than one of universalism. We're coming to the end of our time. There's one question which I'd love to hear that both the two of you answer, though, which is from it's another one from Daniel Levy, who said that what would a second Trump term mean? Can Europe step up if that happens? And I think that is something which is obviously unpredictable, given how unpredictable Trump has been in the first term and how that's a sort of core part of his cultural DNA. But I think it is worth maybe ending with that, as we've spent a lot of time talking about what we would do with a Biden presidency.
I think a second Trump term would regarding Europe. I mean, Trump, would make permanent a lot of things that he has been more restrained, mostly because of constraints within his administration. I mean, I think that he's been very consistent on his view of German cars, and I think that that Europe would really have an enemy in the United States and have to choose either to go towards this, go towards a more united front when it comes to defense policy, or be shredded into spheres of influence, or basically turn into a retirement home and not want to engage in the world. With that said, I think a Trump presidency would bode worse regarding the U.S. I think that what you saw with the Black Lives Matter protests is basically what you're going to get for 4 years if Trump gets reelected, because what you would see, the only route towards his reelection at this point, is through another, loss of the popular vote, and and some type of issues with whose votes get counted, and for a generation that's been electrified politically for the first time to be let down in the democratic process, so badly, would really bode badly for what happens here in the street.
Great, thank you very much, Alex. Ivan, what do you think Europeans will do?
Yeah. Listen, we of course should wait for the next John Bolton to tell us what exactly is going to happen. But I do believe that regardless how the situation is going to develop, for the Europeans, United States is the foreign power that has the highest leverage over European politics. Not simply economy, but domestic politics. It has an allies. So if we're going to imagine a Trump presidency, which is going to be quite divisive with the United States, which is also going to intensify, particularly the competition with China, then I do believe that European Union is simply going to be in a survival mode.
Okay. Well, thank you very much to you for a fascinating discussion, to both of you. We are running out of time now, and I think have to bring this session to a close, and indeed to bring the whole annual council meeting for ECFR 2020 to a close. It's been quite a big experiment, managing a council meeting without being able to meet in person. It's not been the same, obviously, in terms of the quality of our interactions together, the ability to hug one another, and the sort of general feeling of hope that comes from bringing this remarkable community together once a year. But I think it has been a rather wonderful couple of days where we have been on a kaleidoscopic journey around the world, looking at a lot of the big issues facing Europe at the moment. I've certainly learned a huge amount, and it's been really exciting to see so many key figures from different bits of the European landscape coming together, to see all of these different ministers together, to see Josep Borrell and Margrethe Vestager, to see Bruno Le Maire and Alex Stubb, and to see historians and all of the different council members from different parts of Europe's varied and exciting tapestry, as well as to have so many representatives from Germany as it takes up the presidency of the EU. We've talked about digital politics, about climate, about culture, about history, about the future of every single region where ECFR is working, the Middle East and North Africa, the African challenge, the Balkans, about Russia and its role in its neighborhood. And I think it's quite appropriate that we ended both looking at how Europeans see the world themselves and how that's going to shape the politics that we have going forward, but also this critical question about the future of the transatlantic relationship. It remains for me just to say a huge thank you to all the people who made this happen, my colleagues at ECFR under the leadership of Vesla Chanova, particularly Felix Mengel, but many other people who've managed to bring all of you together in this virtual way, and also to thank again ECFR's donors and partners who make this all possible: the Open Society Foundation, the Stiftung Mercator, the Robert Bosch Foundation, the Gulbenkian Foundation, the Compagnia di San Paolo, as well as many of the European governments that support our work coming in and out. We are going to use a lot of the material that came out of the last couple of days to try and stimulate a debate around Europe's future. There'll be podcasts, there'll be videos, and there is a YouTube recording of this if some of you have enjoyed it so much that you want to see it once again, which is on our website at www.ecfr.eu. And I just want to say a huge thank you to all for coming and for making this such a special couple of days. And I very much hope that ECFR's annual council meeting in 2021 will be one where we can meet in person again and have a bit more physical contact and some physical food for our bodies, as well as the important spiritual nourishment that we've got this year. Many thanks to all of you, and goodbye.